Today, we're talking to Dr. Richard Nisbett, one of the world's most accomplished social psychologists and author of the book Thinking, a Memoir, published on Acculturation Books. Welcome, Dr. Nisbett.
Hi.
So let's start with talking a bit about the differences in how Eastern and Western cultures think. How did you get started with this research?
Well, it's an interesting story. In 1982, I went to China to give lectures at Beijing University. And I spent a great deal of time doing homework, reading about Chinese history and intellectual history and so on. And it was very interesting. The most interesting thing to me was that there was clearly a completely different understanding of the relationship between the individual and society. In Chinese history, the individual is very much subordinate to the society as a whole, quite unlike the US or in other Western countries with our individualism. Actually meeting Chinese people didn't lead me to understand that there were any important differences in the mentality or personality or anything else between Chinese and Americans. I felt like I understood them on the same terms that they understood me. So I was kind of lulled into thinking that actually we're all the same. And I was always a fervent universalist. But there was a brilliant student there at the time who could barely speak English, but he made it clear to me he was really, really smart. And years later, he came to Michigan to study with me. And after we had been working together for a while, he said, Dick, you and I think in very different ways. And I said, oh, really? Tell me more. And then he
skeptical, probably, right?
Yeah. All right. So he tells me an abbreviated version of the following. It says, you think in a very logical way. You focus on something that you want to achieve in your world. You categorize it. You apply the rules that pertain to that category. I, on the other hand, and other Chinese, and as it turns out, other East Asians in general, see the world holistically. We don't try to be terribly logical about things. We see relationships and similarities which would escape you as a Westerner. So I said, well, God, that's fascinating. Not believing him really for a minute. But thinking that, I'm sure there's something to that. So I said, let's test it. And we started doing research, and it turned out to be remarkable. The extent to which the two mentalities are different is just astonishing.
It's interesting that it doesn't come across with casual interaction. I also lived for a year and a half in China, and I didn't come away with a strong, of course, I sensed it was a different culture, but in terms of cognitive science, I didn't get a strong feeling that there was a huge difference. It's not obvious just with chatting with people.
No, it isn't. It's strange why such huge differences don't really reveal themselves in ordinary interaction. We understand one another in terms of personality quite well. They're the coordinates in which East Asians and Westerners differ from one another. That is, Easterners from Easterners and Westerners from Westerners. Those coordinates work perfectly well crossing boundaries. So the personality differences they don't seem to be large at all.
So this reference to holistic thinking versus individualistic? What would the opposite of holistic thinking be?
Analytic is what
analytic.
Right.
So what's an everyday example where an East Asian might view things differently from a Westerner?
Well, I'm going to key on that word view, because our most astonishing results are for visual perception. If you show, these original studies were done with Japanese. And by the way, when I talk about East Asians, of course, they differ those cultures differ from one another enormously. Japanese culture is utterly different from Chinese. But with respect to the kinds of things I'm talking about, it's East Asians as a whole, the generalizations work, versus Westerners as a whole. So In one early study, we showed Japanese and American participants underwater scenes, which lasted for 20 seconds. And then we stopped the scene and we say, tell me what you saw. The Americans say, well, I saw 3 big fish swimming off to the left. They had fins on their backs and on their bellies, and they had pink stipples kind of on their stomachs. And there were rocks and shells on the bottom and so on. The Japanese virtually never start with these describing the most salient parts. They describe the context. They say, well, I saw what looked like a stream. The water was green. There were rocks and shells on the bottom. There were 3 big fish swimming off to the left. And the 2 national groups report about the same amount of information about the most salient objects, those 3 big fish or whatever. But the Japanese pick up 60% more information about the context and twice as much information about relationships, like the frog was on the plant. And I mean, you don't get results as strong as this in the social sciences. I mean, you get statistical significance. I mean, this is you don't have to use statistical tests on this. The differences are so huge. And in general, Asians are picking up much more about both the physical environment and the social environment than Westerners are. They just see a tremendous amount more. Hanging out with East Asians as much as I have for the last 20 years, I've begun to imitate them a bit.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I started paying attention to my context more, and really things happen in social situations that just go right over the heads of ordinary Westerners, certainly me. And if you start really paying attention to how does everybody in the room feel about this? I mean, there's a huge amount of information and we just let wash over us, don't pay attention. They're picking it up.
Yeah, I read Joe Henrich's book, The Weirdest People in the World, recently, and he was talking about how sometimes the cultural differences that you find in studies are actually lower than what they should be because people are testing university students who are more and more being trained in a Western tradition and being sort of re-enculturated or being enculturated into the Western way of thinking, no matter where they are on Earth.
Right. I mean, we're creating a new category of person with Western education. East Asians coming to the U.S. and learning about Western cultures. One of this study I just told you about with the underwater scenes, this was done with a Japanese student, now a professor in Canada, named Takahiko Masuda. And he said, of course, this is very early in our acquaintance. He said, Easterners pick up a lot more about context, visual context, than Americans do. That struck me as unlikely. And I said, well, God, that's fascinating. Let's test that. He said, well, everybody knows that. I said, Taka, everybody does not know that. So
in psychology, you have to test it anyway, even if everybody knows it.
That's right. That's right. Well, I'm his professor, so of course I tell him to test it. Okay, boss, I'll test it. So the category of person is somebody raised in an East Asian culture and having that whole panoply of skills, cognitive skills that East Asians have, but completely understanding Western ways of thinking at the same time. And by the way, in the one study we did, this is everything I tell you today will be, fact that I would stand by with confidence. But the one attempt that we made to see how soon do you have to begin to pick up Western culture and how long do you have to be in it before you begin to have essentially Western ways of thinking. So we did a study looking at people in the Silicon Valley area who had immigrated to this country at ages ranging from infancy to like age 20, who had lived here, for varying amounts of time, coming at different ages. And we thought, oh, well, we'll be able to find it. And so, do you have to be here by the age of 10 to be significantly shifted in a Western direction of perception and cognition? And it turned out that all of our subjects in general had completely shifted. I mean, because they had all been here for at least 10 years. And they came at different ages, but they were indistinguishable from University of Michigan students.
Very interesting.
On the tests that we used. Now, if we'd looked at people in Chinatown in New York, would we have gotten that? I can't imagine that we would have. But I mean, Silicon Valley, people there are highly educated. It's a very diverse community. You're constantly throwing in people with different cultures. So they get acculturated much more rapidly there than they would if they were in some, other American environment. So at any rate, but there's millions of people, and increasingly more all the time, who've been exposed to both kinds of cultures and who are, if you look at Americans with various tests that we've looked at, who are East Asian in background versus Western, for some of our tests, the East Asians are indistinguishable from native-born acculturated Western type Americans. For some things, they look just like East Asians. I mean, just like East Asians living in East Asia. And I don't have any good generalizations about which kinds of skills are the ones that are going to be shifted heavily in a Western direction, and which kinds are going to remain East Asian in character.
Well, let's start with logical thinking. You say in your book there's something particularly Western about the logical approach to thought. So this is more than just visual perception here. What is it about logic and the Western mind?
Well, we care about logic more than most people realize, I think. We actually have a very clear logical structure in our minds on it, which is modus ponens. That is, if P, then Q, means that if P is the case, then Q is the case. I mean, that's just wired in to the thinking apparatus of modern Western people. I mean, pre-modern people don't have that. I mean, there's a wonderful study by a Russian psychologist done with peasants who had no education at all. And he would say things to them like, as you know, all bears in the North are white. And a little later he says, hey, I got a letter from a friend of mine who lives in the North. And he told me that recently he had seen a bear. What color do you suppose it was? And for Americans, for God's sake, I mean, you just told me, and they're all white, and they'll say, well, how should I know? Ask your friend who told you about the bear. I couldn't know what it was. And to us, that's stupefyingly stupid. But the same was true of Westerners until you begin to get formal education. And in formal education, there's you just over and over again, you see if P, then Q, P, therefore Q. But that's not so well grounded, even among highly educated East Asians, that particular form. So and the same thing is true of syllogisms. If you tell an American, all birds have an omentum, that's a made-up thing.
Okay.
And then you later ask them, how plausible, how likely is it to you that robins have an omentum? And they say, oh, gosh, of course they do. But if you say, how likely is it that penguins have an omentum? They'll hesitate a bit. Well, I guess they do because all birds do. Koreans may just say, no, they find it implausible. Brahmin's okay. They got a momentum, but if it's this very atypical member of the category, they don't readily apply this generalization. If they're forced, if P then Q, you tell me a P, it's going to be a Q. That's just not a part of the way they automatically think.
So it sounds like maybe we could characterize it as Westerns have very rigid set boundaries in their heads. And if something is either something is or isn't a bird, and everything that's bird-like applies to everything in the set. And it sounds like with the Koreans, it's much more, but when you get closer to a fuzzy boundary, the bets are off kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And the categorization itself is something that differs a great deal. Westerners are constantly categorizing things. But the study that we've done, actually, the original study here was done, it was the first East-West cognitive difference study ever done, was by a Chinese-American psychologist who would show Chinese kids and American kids 3 pictures, say a cow, grass, and a monkey, and ask the kid, which 2 of these go together?
Right.
Americans say, well, the cow and the monkey, because they're both animals. The East Asian says, well, the cow and the grass, because the cow eats the grass. So the world is seen in terms of categories. By the Westerners, it's seen in terms of relationships by the Easterners. Very
interesting. And I read in your book that logic is not only less prominent in Eastern cultures, but sometimes viewed negatively. Like they know what it is. They just don't like it as much.
Exactly. When the conversation started, let's strip the context away from this thing and look at just the propositions in an abstract sense. The East Asians, they know what you're doing, but I mean, it seems childish to them, foolish to strip away the context. And that's just, the law in East Asia is much more flexible in the sense that it pays attention to context. We strip the context. You did X, X is illegal, you're going to jail. The East Asian, well, you did X, but if you look at the context, it's understandable. Most people would have done that, and there might not be punishment.
Right. So in the West, the law is written often quite clearly, and then the discretion comes through the judge, right? But are you saying that the laws themselves are a little more context-based?
I'm not so sure. I'd have to think about that for a minute. Certainly, application of the law, much more attentive to context. Whether the law themselves are written in a context, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
Right. My wife's a lawyer. That's the only reason I mentioned it. So she was always, the context comes up in the trial, right? Or the hearing.
Right.
But of course, the law is written by, you have to, if you have these criteria, then it is, whether to prosecute or not is a judgment call. But yeah, that's interesting.
We just saw a national demonstration of this difference. And,
oh, yeah?
Yeah. Well, in the Judge Jackson's hearing, there was, she didn't apply the law to its maximum in a lot of child pornography viewing cases. And the Republicans tore after her. The guy was looking at those pictures, he's gone to jail. And she said, well, it's an 18-year-old kid you're talking about who didn't really know what he was stumbling onto. No. She's a soft on the law judge, because
according to the
Republicans.
Right. So we've got these results. Okay. And then we've got this theory that it's because they've got a culture that thinks differently, but you also have a kind of a historical or geographical explanation for this, right?
Right. Yeah, I think ultimately the differences are economic. China, which is the origin of all East Asian cultures, and Confucianism is that is woven into the mentality of all Eastern Asian cultures, as well as Southeastern Asian cultures. But China is very well suited to plantation agriculture, large fields, level irrigation, plentiful sources of irrigation. So it's basically plantation style agriculture, which requires cooperation among people in order to be effective.
Okay.
And action in general in the East is dependent on your relations with other people, because cooperation is the way that things get done. In Greece, where Western culture originates, plantation agriculture really isn't possible for the most part. Greece is mountains descending to the sea, and the occupations that you have are fishing, trading, kitchen gardens, herding of animals. And these are relatively isolated, asocial kinds of occupations that don't require strong coordination with other people for the most part. Now, logic developed in Greece. The story goes and that Aristotle got tired of hearing lousy arguments in the marketplace and in the political assembly. So he said, look, can we agree if your argument has this structure, it's a lousy argument. And that's, to a remarkable extent, the basis of Western thought. I mean, get rid of the context. What's the structure of the argument? Does it make sense? And this is just not the way. The whole goal of Eastern culture is to have smooth interaction. I mean, the word harmony it's just, you hear it all the time in all kinds of contexts in East Asia. And it means getting along with other people. An anecdote will show the difference between the Western mentality in this respect and the Eastern mentality. A Japanese friend of mine who's lived a lot in the US and likes a lot of the aspects of US culture and had a lot of Japanese friends, and all of them realized that they love the tradition of the American dinner party, from the martinis to apple pie, the discussion that goes on. So they were all back in Japan at one point. They said, let's have an American dinner party. And it was a total failure because the grease, as it were, of the American dinner party is opinion. Did you see Power of the Dog? Yeah, I hated it. Really? I loved it. In Japan, you can't do that. You saw the Power of the Dog? I liked it, but if I said that and you didn't like it, then where would we be?
No, disharmony.
Right, disharmony. I mean, disagreement. Oh my God, another martini, quick. So
what do they build the conversation more about finding points of consensus? And
yeah, probably. I don't know. I've never been to a Japanese occasion like.
Yeah. So what's interesting, right? Like, because we have, in other work I know has shown that herding cultures have a more individualistic social attitude, right. For what, and they give a similar reason. It's interesting that it carries over into basic perception and thinking as well. But and I normally would be a little skeptical of your explanation, but you've done what almost like not quite a controlled study, but you found it in a Turkish study, right, where you took people who had different of these geographical conditions, but were from the same basic culture and found differences too. You want to tell me about that?
Yeah, well, actually, it was people all in the same town.
Oh, the same town! Wow,
in the same town, and there were three main occupations. One was herding, the other was fishing on the open sea with, fishing crews, and the other was farming. And we actually did a version of this cow grass monkey study and a couple of other of our cognitive studies, looking at these three groups. Well, the farmers and the fishers their whole effectiveness is dependent on what other people are doing. I've got to be doing the right thing. Well, you're doing your right thing, or it's just not going to work out. The herds people, it's just me and the herd. They don't have to do any interaction. So sure enough, the farmers and the fishers are holistic. They see relationships where the herders see categories. Now that's just one study, but then the next study in this series, I was not involved in this, but somebody looked at North China versus South China, and there's a difference between the way you earn your living, farming. In the North, it's mostly wheat, which is, like the American farm is, it's just the farmer, and his family. So it's not highly dependent on other people. But the South is mostly rice, and rice agriculture is extremely dependent on other people. You have to coordinate the irrigation system. You have to coordinate your planting at the same time with other people who are doing, all together on everybody's property, et cetera. And sure enough, North Chinese are more analytic, and Southern Chinese are more holistic, more concerned with relationships, less concerned with categories, and so on. So yeah, I think we have, historical hypotheses are so hard to prove one way or another. But I have another geographical point or cultural difference point. Greeks to this day are argumentative. That's not the point. I have a friend who's...
Are they?
Yeah, so he says, here's a typical Greek event. You're at dinner with his wife's family. He himself is, Anglo-American. She is Greek-American. And you say, would you please pass the salt? He says, this food doesn't need salt. So I would like some salt. No, salt is bad for your health. Please pass the salt. Look, it will wreck the taste of this if you had to. 10 minutes later, the guy still hasn't got the salt because there's no battle about whether salt, you should be having salt. No, that's one. So the disagreement, the comfort with disagreement is characteristic. And that culture gave us logic. So I recently had occasion to encounter Indians and Indian Americans, and they're highly argumentative. In fact, there's a book by a Nobel Prize winner from India called The Argumentative Indian. And then there's yet another culture in the world that does argument for thousands of years. It's the Jewish culture, especially the rabbinical tradition. Where you just sit around all day and argue about something. And all three of those cultures, continue that. And there are South Asians in general are argumentative, and they are highly, highly successful in the West. The concept of a unicorn, that's the billion-dollar startup. In the US, there have been 90 startups by Indians. The next closest is Israel, and there is no third place.
Wow.
It's really massive differences. And you think about it, and we now know that CEOs, South Asians are more likely to be CEOs of American corporations than native-born Americans.
Wow.
American culture. East Asians are much less likely to be CEOs of American cultures and of American companies. So argumentation and a certain kind of effectiveness or putting yourself out there, assertiveness, is very characteristic of Jewish culture, of Indian culture, and of American culture relative to at least to East Asian culture.
Okay, so let's bring about it back to science. I'm interested in the origin of science, which of course had its origins in the West, but it doesn't seem obvious to me that science benefits more from ignoring relationships between things. So do you have anything to say about how or if this Western way of thinking was particularly conducive to the invention of science?
Well, the world is just one anecdote after another, unless you get systematic about it. And how do you get systematic? Well, you categorize things and you figure out what rules apply to them. And if that's the way you're thinking, you can be a scientist. If that's alien to you, then you're not going to have science. I mean, there's the wonderful fact that the Chinese understood metaphysics much better than the Greeks did. They understood, for example, the gravity. They understood acoustics. They understood magnetism. All of these have to do with relationships. And these things were not understood in the West until science discovered them. But they didn't have, despite the fact that they had very superior metaphysics to the Greeks, they didn't invent science. They didn't do experiments. And it's because science just is categories and rules. That's
stripping context.
Yes, and stripping context. What is irrelevant to what's going on here? Let's just keep throwing away context until we get
right. It seems like the extreme of that is like a physics equation, like F equals ma. It's like, force of what? Well, no, it doesn't matter, and that's
right.
Now after this conversation, it sounds like that's a very distinctively Western way to approach thinking about stuff.
Both are, of course, there's great power of both. I mean, paying attention to as broad context as you can is the right way to solve some kinds of problems. Throwing away the context is the right way to solve other kinds of problems.
Yeah, it sounds like that kind of thinking would be, very good for domains in which the interactions between the parts are really prominent, like ecology, right, versus anatomy, for example, right? Anatomy, maybe you can get away with focusing on just an object and its parts and its traits. But, in ecology, it's all about the relationship. So it's interesting to think about how the Eastern mindset could contribute to scientific hypotheses and theories and that kind of thing.
Right. There are some nice examples of how science looks at different questions and gets answers across cultures. The chimpanzee politics was a discovery of the Japanese.
Interesting.
I mean, Westerners could only see a dyad, this chimp and that chimp, this chimp and that chimp. They said, okay, here's what's going on in this society. Here's and they see the groups and the interactions and so they the Western mind's terrific in lots of ways, but it took the Eastern mind to see what was going on with the chimpanzee culture.
If I had a big family, and needed family therapy, I might try to choose an East Asian therapist. It'd be the only one who could figure it out. Well, thank you so much for talking to us. You can read Richard Nisbett's book, Thinking, a Memoir, which has stuff about what we've been talking about here, but also many other things, plus the very interesting story of his life. And I particularly appreciated learning about how psychology used to be done, and I thought that was very interesting, the way he navigated all of that. It was published by Acura Books in 2021, and we'll put a link to the book in the show notes. Thank you so much, Dr. Nisbett.
Thank you.